Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 44. And so much has happened over the last couple of days, it is difficult to cram it all in to a single episode. So, by necessity, we're going to be looking at quite a high level at these stories, but we hope to dive into some of them in a lot more detail in the coming days in full-length interviews with experts on the different subjects. Now, normally we start these videos by looking at Ukraine because Ukraine remains the main focus of this channel. However, there's a lot happening in Georgia. And of course, over the weekend, there has been some extraordinary changes in Moscow. So we're going to start with that story because of its significance and, of course, examine what the implications for Ukraine's victory may be. We start with the Kiev Independent that talks about Putin's firing of his defense minister, Shoigu, and the appointment of a new person to that role. But that's not the only change. There seems to be a whole raft of changes going on in Moscow, and at the moment it's highly speculative as to the reasons and logic behind these changes. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin on May the 12th proposed firing the defense minister Sergei Shoigu and nominated Andrei Belousov to replace him, according to the Telegram channels of the Federal Council, the Russian parliament's upper house. Putin appointed Shoigu as Secretary of Russia's Security Council. This is perhaps a move that no one saw coming because he replaces the longtime confidant and close advisor to Putin, Nikolai Patrushev. It is not clear yet what role Patrushev, if any, will be moved into. Now, we know that Shoigu has faced massive criticism internally, including from Z Patriots and Russia's pro-war hawks for mishandling the war effort in Ukraine. However, it is not at all clear if his dismissal is a demotion, since the position of the Security Council's secretary is considered to be amongst the most powerful in the country. And who is Belousov? Well, he's known as a supporter of boosting military spending and mobilizing Russia's economy for the war effort. Belousov is also a technocrat and an economist by training. So this may well be an effort by Vladimir Putin to gear up for the long war, a marathon rather than a sprint. Well, we're already 3 years into this, so we are already into that sort of marathon in any case. But Russia's military industrial complex and indeed its civilian economy is coming under more and more strain. So appointing a technocrat to this role may be a way of focusing on logistics and making Russia fit enough to be able to slog this war out for more years to come. And it's also important to note, and this actually was stressed by Dmitry Peskov, the habitual liar and Kremlin spokesman. He said that Putin had decided to appoint a civilian as defense minister, since the ministry should be open to innovation and progressive ideas. But this is perhaps also repeating the mistake of having Shoigu, again, someone with absolutely no military experience at all, in such a senior position within the defense ministry. Shoigu, and it's likely Belousov, know nothing at all about military strategy. So what's the implication here for Ukraine? Well, they may be able to improve logistics. They may be able to, through this change, downgrade the impact of corruption on supply lines and so on. Then again, maybe they won't. But what they won't be doing by this change of role is introducing new strategic skills in terms of the battlefield, because it's unlikely that Belousov really understands anything about that. There has also been other commentary that maybe the firing of Shoigu was something to do with his massive corruption and how that corruption has hollowed out the Russian military and contributed towards its failures in Ukraine. Well, that criticism is based on the idea that somehow corruption is the exception to the rule in the Russian system. And that is absolutely not the case. Corruption is a feature, not a bug. It is highly unlikely that Shoigu will have been dismissed through corruption. It's highly unlikely that anyone internally really will care that much, because Everybody has their hands in the till. The entire system is constructed so that people can fleece money out of that economic vertical. And the higher you are in that hierarchy, the higher the pecking order you are, then you have the right to take more money, not to each according to his skill, but the Russian system is all about to each according to his loyalty and seniority. If you're closer to the Tsar, you can legitimately steal more. So this is unlikely to be the real reason for his dismissal. And it may well be that a new defense minister coming in, someone who is moving into that senior position, will take this as a green light that he can start thieving on a grander scale. Let's hope that these Russian traditions continue, because it'll mean that Russia will not fundamentally change enough in order to have a victory in Ukraine or to fundamentally alter the balance of power on the battlefield. Bilsov, however, is not new to politics. He was Russia's economy minister in 2012 to 13 and an aide to Putin in 2013 to 2020. He was the first deputy prime minister in 2020 to 24. So, of course, he is extremely close to Putin and the Kremlin. And at this point in time, it is not surprising that Putin would appoint somebody who is a loyalist or perceived to be one. Now let's turn to Georgia, because this is getting a little bit of coverage in the mainstream media, but not nearly as much as I think it deserves. We are seeing a history-defining set of events in Georgia, which more and more takes on the characteristic of a second Maidan revolution. This is from the Moscow Times. Thousands rally in Tbilisi against the Foreign Influence Bill. Thousands of protesters marched through central Tbilisi on Saturday at a rally against a controversial foreign influence bill backed by the Georgian government and likened to Russia's laws that have been introduced silencing dissent. And of course, similar laws have been appearing all over the place in the so-called Russian sphere of influence. This seems to take on the character of a concerted effort by Russia to assist autocrats everywhere and would-be autocrats to entrench their power and fight back against what they would see as color revolutions and CIA interference, but what most normal people would see as the emergence of real, genuine, organic politics. Massive rallies have gripped the Black Sea Caucasus country for almost a month after the ruling Georgian Dream Party revived the bill that was dropped last year because of the huge backlash that engendered. Demonstrators converged on Tbilisi's Central Europe Square on Saturday evening in the latest protests. And as this has been going on, we have seen the government deploy not just police, but irregular thugs as well onto the streets, and they have unleashed cruel and extraordinary violence on protesters, but also on many opposition spokespeople, on professors, and those in the intelligentsia. And there are horrific pictures of the beatings they sustained and the injuries that has caused. Under pouring rain, protesters chanted no to the Russian law and no to the Russian dictatorship, waving red and white Georgian flags and blue EU flags in a sea of umbrellas on the large square. "We are protecting our European future and our freedom," said one of the protesters, Mariam Mirungia, and who works for a German company, adding that she fears her country is going in the direction of Russia. "We do not want to return to the Soviet Union," said another protester. The European Union and the United States, the United Nations have spoken out against the legislation and have also voiced concern about the violence against protesters. But really, the West needs to be doing more. We need to see that this is an existential struggle for democracy around the world and emerging democracies in the backyard of Russia, the former territory of the USSR. We need to understand that Russia is going to be doing everything it can to destroy and crush the ability of people to decide their own fate and take charge of their own destiny. We need to be lending them more support rather than sending thoughts prayers and concern. Now let's turn to Ukraine, because one of the significant developments in the last week is the new Russian offensive in the Kharkiv direction. This is from the Kyiv Independent. This is dated May the 11th. Russian forces in the Kharkiv Oblast are contained, but fighting continues. Russian forces have been involved in a new offensive operation targeting the Kharkiv Oblast. They are apparently contained and have not advanced deep into Ukrainian territory. And this was announced on 11th of May. The situation is changing. We'll come to the latest battle news in a second. Ukraine's defense ministry reported that Russian forces had launched an attempt to break through in the Kharkiv Oblast. We can only assume that their target is to try and attack the huge city, Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv. The General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces later that day reported that Ukrainian troops were fending off Russian forces in the Lipitsky and Vovchansk directions in the north of Kharkiv Oblast as Moscow deployed infantry and heavy equipment. Many people are voicing doubts about whether Russia has the numbers of troops or the equipment or indeed the strategic plans or skill to actually mount an attack on Kharkiv itself, let alone take it. If you remember the period of time it took to take Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Soledar, Ugledar, and others, Kharkiv is on an altogether different scale. It would be like 1,000 Bakhmuts. It's highly unlikely that Russia has the resources to take that on. And that is echoed by a phrase from Alexander Pivnenko, who is the commander of Ukraine's National Guard. Russia would need years to occupy Kharkiv in its entirety, he said. But Russia's incursion has caused terror, destruction, and one must assume a terrible suffering from the civilian population of the area. In fact, civilians have been fleeing Vovchansk, which has come under heavy Russian bombardment as that ground offensive rolls out. We've also been getting reports from correspondents on the ground that Russia is sending glide bombs en masse into that town. And of course, we know the scale of destruction those can unleash, which means that Vovchansk, like many other Ukrainian towns, will probably be turned into a shell, into a pile of charred bricks and timbers over the next couple of days and weeks. Vovchansk is ground zero for Russia's new offensive in Kharkiv Oblast, the first time a serious push has been made to take territory across the border since the area was liberated from Russian occupation in Ukraine's lightning offensive in September 2022. Now the town is on the brink of becoming the first major settlement to be occupied by Russia for a second time since it was liberated. But the prospect of a new and larger offensive on the scale of the Kharkiv one has loomed for months. And now it comes at a time when Ukrainian forces are reported to be overstretched and are starting to lose ground, not just here, but also in the Donetsk Oblast. Now, it remains to be seen whether this is a full offensive in its own right, or whether this is intended to create a distraction, to divert Ukrainian forces away from the hotspot of Donetsk and give the Russians a chance to break through there. The strategy is not clear at the moment. By the time these articles came out yesterday and this morning, Russian forces had reached the outskirts of the town of Vovchansk, and the unfolding situation is not clear. And civilians fleeing the area have been quoted as saying it is now impossible to live there. And coaches, buses, evacuation teams have been mobilized to help civilians get out of that area and get to safety. And finally, in a comment on this, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Army has said that the battle for Vovchansk is ongoing. This is the latest story from this morning, but it has admitted that Russia is achieving some, quotes, tactical successes. Now, the Kiev Independent writes in some details about the successes of Russian forces in the Donetsk Oblast and its offensive on Cheritin, as Ukraine's defenders and allies display a constellation of weakness. Russian forces are taking advantage and pushing forward in Donetsk Oblast, says the publication. The Russians have begun their assault on Chasiv Yar, while a complementary flanking assault is slowly pushing up from occupied Avdiivka in an attempt to cut the supply road from Kramatorsk to Konstantinivka. Chasiv Yar is the foyer of Konstantinivka, a larger town that has served an important Ukrainian military staging ground. Their intention is to approach the main transit hubs and thereby render the defense of Donetsk Oblast systemically difficult to sustain, says Michael Kaufman, a military scholar from the DC-based Carnegie Endowment. In the past few days, their forces have breached Ukrainian defenses, overrunning Chechnya, a frontline village in Donetsk Oblast. The beleaguered defenders withdrew from several nearby villages on April the 28th as the Russian presence in the area continued to expand. Although they've kept the Russians from breaking through, Ukrainian units are having a very hard time on this part of the front line. There are many reasons for this, including the ongoing impacts of the ammunition shortages, shortage of supply, personnel, and in some units, a lack of training, experience, and organization. Some have also complained about a lack of sufficient support or clear planning from the general staff or the government. But the full outcome of this offensive remains to be seen. Kaufman has said that the general view is that Russia lacks the capacity to use its forces on a scale sufficient for a major breakthrough and cannot sustain the momentum at the current pace. And all these issues on the front lines show why it is so important to help give Ukraine what it needs, not just in dribs and drabs or just in time, but give it more than it needs to get the job done. We should be building in security to the supplies to Ukraine and in training their troops as well, not constantly taking the riskiest scenario by delaying everything, pushing it to the last minute, and forcing upon Ukraine more losses than it needs to sustain to hold the line. And in this spirit, there's an article in the Kiev Independent which talks about the Czech president, who says that Europe must set clear boundaries for Russia. This is dated May the 11th. Russia does not seek cooperation with Europe. And if European countries want to ensure peace and prosperity, they must set clear boundaries for Moscow, Czech President Petr Pavel said in an interview with the Austrian newspaper Die Presse. Tensions between Russia and Europe have been mounting, of course, since it launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine more than 2 years ago. According to the Czech president, Russia continues to see itself as a superpower with the right to dictate rules. Europe's support for Ukraine is therefore in its own interests, he added. If we want to maintain security and prosperity in this part of Europe, we must set clear boundaries for Russia. Should we fail, it could lead to serious complications in the future. That, of course, is an understatement. Russia is not just looking to make minor gains in the east of Ukraine. It is quite clear that Russia wants to upend the international order, wants to diminish the role of the US and the role of rule of law throughout the world. This has become increasingly clear from experts that we have interviewed on this channel. And in this spirit too, unfortunately, we don't hear this from Scholz, but we are starting to hear German lawmakers, some of them, some individual lone voices, talking in an extremely tough and necessary way. Again, this is from the Kiev Independent, and it states that a German lawmaker suggests that allies could protect the sky over Western Ukraine from NATO soil. Some German lawmakers from both the ruling and opposition parties have supported the idea of allies defending the airspace over Western Ukraine from NATO territory. Polish officials have also mentioned this possibility, but no concrete decisions have been presented. Defending the airspace over Ukraine from Poland and Romania should not be ruled out in the long term, said Anton Hofreiter from the co-ruling Green Party. The lawmaker nevertheless added that the matter is currently not under discussion, as allies focus on supplying additional defensive aid to Ukraine. Berlin has proved itself, of course, to be a leader in the provision of air defense support for Ukraine and launched an allied initiative aiming at securing additional air defense systems and pledging its third Patriot battery to Kiev. So these are good ideas, and it's good to hear them start to appear. But as we've seen with the previous supply of munitions, whether it is Leopards, Abrams, Patriots, and other systems, and of course F-16s, and of course F-16s aren't even in play yet, and we're more than 2 years in. Point where these ideas are raised, the point where they get discussed in legislatures and actually passed and adopted, that needs to shrink dramatically. We need to stop playing with the security of Europe and stop playing with the lives of Ukrainians. Another piece of good news, and this is the announcement that the US has unveiled another $400 million defense aid package for Europe. This follows the $61 billion approved just a couple of weeks ago. US President Joe Biden on May the 10th authorized a $400 million defense aid package for Ukraine, according to a statement on the White House's website. I hereby delegate to the Secretary of State to direct the drawdown of up to $400 million in defense articles and services of the Department of Defense to provide assistance to Ukraine, the statement read. The Pentagon unveiled the content of new packages, and there are some significant announcements in here, namely ammunition for the Patriot and NASAMS air defense systems, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, HIMARS systems and ammunition, 155 and 105 millimeter artillery shells, and equipment to integrate into Western launchers, missiles, and radars with Ukrainian systems. The package further contains Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, M113 armored personnel carriers, mine-resistant ambush-protected MRAP vehicles, trailers, tow missiles, Javelin and AT-4 anti-tank launchers, precision aerial munitions, and high-speed anti-radiation missiles, HARMS. In addition, it contains small arms and small arms ammunition, demolition munitions, coastal patrol boats, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear protective equipment, spare parts, and other ancillary equipment. This will not be the last package required to help Ukraine achieve victory. It will not even be the last package required to allow Ukraine to stay in the fight, but it is to be welcomed nonetheless. Now let's turn to some interesting individual news stories to help build out a picture of what's going on. This one is again from the Kyiv Independent, and it talks about Ukraine potentially starting to discuss the recruitment of 20,000 convicts into the army. Now, this isn't an exact mirror of the Russian law. This will not involve people accused of murder and serious crimes. But of course, it is a step that suggests a certain level of desperation in terms of needing people to fill the ranks in Ukraine's army, especially as it becomes depleted month in, month out. And the mobilization law that has been passed struggles to get the required number of troops to build up the numbers to match the swelling numbers we see on the Russian side. Ukraine could fill its ranks with as many as 20,000 convicts in a move that could also help ease overcrowding in Ukrainian prisons, the Justice Minister told BBC Ukraine in an interview published on May the 10th. Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, passed a bill on May the 8th that permits those convicted of certain offences to serve in the military, paving the way for the voluntary mobilization of prisoners. Many have supported the bill, but it's also been pointed out that it is up to Ukraine's armed forces to determine who is suitable for them and who is not. And that is crucial. They don't want to dilute the will and commitment of Ukrainian forces. And of course, they don't want to dilute the skills that are required on the front or create increased risks for those who are serving. Prisoners, as I said, who are serving due to extreme crimes, including murder, should be left to serve their sentences and will not be recruited into the army. And another story which did get quite a bit of coverage in the mainstream media, and this is Russia's highly militarized Victory Day celebrations. These have nothing at all to do with World War II, suggests the Kyiv Independent. The legacy of Soviet victory over Nazi Germany feeds pro-war aggression in Putin's Russia. It is celebrated with an almost religious fervor. It has nothing to do with never again. Rather, yes, we can is the motto that you're more likely to hear in Russia. The article examines the evolution of the Victory Day parade from those grand militaristic parades in the Soviet Union to the more low-key ones we saw in the 1990s. But when Russian President Vladimir Putin swept into power in 2000, he faced a divided country. The disintegration of the Soviet Union, the economic downturn that followed, had left deep scars on Russian society. He felt a sense of national humiliation, and of course, he weaponized it. He even, I would argue, exacerbated it. Putin needed a common cause that would unite the masses. The revival of the Russian Orthodox Church back to the highest levels of government was one such step. Another was to revive the Victory Day parades. And the Kremlin was keen to warp that wartime memory for its own ends. The memory of a defensive war became an all-encompassing national myth, a rallying cry for patriotism and an endless source of propaganda. Most of all, that celebration of victory over Nazi Germany has become a validation for Russian aggression in Ukraine, with the Kremlin conjuring up images of Ukrainian neo-Nazi threats in Kiev to justify its invasion. Most people watching this channel will know that it is a lie, that it's a monstrous lie, and it's one that has been created to manipulate Russian people. But, points out NOVAYA GAZETA, there is another aspect to this. While the rise in authoritarianism put an end to the discussion of once highly emotive subjects such as democracy and human rights, and where the examination of Russia's history became highly selective, that history around the start of World War II was completely off the table for most media and historians and schools and others. How the war started is crucially important because Russia started the war as an ally of Nazi Germany. It allowed the Germans to think they could get away with their conquest of Europe without initially being opposed by one of the largest military powers on the continent. But Russian mythology focuses on the period subsequent to that, after the Germans broke their alliance and attacked Moscow. And it's that part, the relatability of Russia as a victim, which almost every Russian family can actually understand, relate to, and it would have been deeply out of character if the Russian government had not tried to mine this tragic part of Russian history for its own ends and manipulations. Those in power, in fact, have been able to reap the political benefit by appearing at war memorials, museum openings, and with veterans, or simply by using the victory narrative in all of their speeches. The Russian government's World War II narrative, says NOVAYA GAZETA, is molded around three main principles. First, it strenuously avoids mentioning the key historical context that might prove awkward, such as the totalitarian reality of life under Stalin, or the traumatic consequences of the Soviet government's wartime decisions. Those consequences led to many, many millions of excess deaths on the Russian side. Second, the state's contemporary recasting of the country's World War II myth avoids any references to communism in an attempt to ensure the collective memory of Russia's wartime heroism is not sullied by the mass murder of innocent people under Stalin. And thirdly, and most importantly, whipping up patriotic fervor has allowed the lines between the war in Ukraine and World War II to become blurred. In some ways, and in a previous video with Anna from Ukraine, we've suggested that actually the Ukraine war for many Russians is a kind of low quality, tasteless cosplay version of World War II. The continuity between the two conflicts is reinforced in Moscow's annual Victory Day parade, which showcases present-day Russian military prowess while nominally commemorating the Red Army's capture of Berlin. Of course, it has to be noted, at this year's parade, there was just one solitary T-34 tank, which underlines the massive and embarrassing losses that have actually been sustained by the Russian army in Ukraine over the last 2 and a bit years. And I'm going to share another piece. This is from the KYIV Post, and it is written by two people who have generously appeared on Silicon Curtain, Ivan Stradner and Jason J. Smart. This is an opinion piece that says that there is a great lie behind Russia's Victory Day. Russians believe their nation contributed more than any other to winning World War II. The uncomfortable truth is that Moscow actually started the war in 1939 as Nazi Germany's ally. And the uncomfortable truth is that many of those deaths, those excess deaths caused by terror, brutality, indifference, incompetence of the Russian government, didn't need to happen and actually served little strategic purpose. What is also brushed over in much of the wartime mythology is what's now becoming apparent, and that is the crimes on a horrific scale caused by Russia and its troops right across the territories it was apparently liberating. The cases of mass rape in Berlin and across Germany, and indeed in other countries that it was supposedly liberating from Nazi Germany, are something that only now is really getting full focus by historians. And the elephant in the room as well, where Russia calls itself an occupier. In fact, it was not dissimilar from the Nazi regime itself. It was taking territories to add to its empire. It had no intention of liberating those peoples in Eastern Europe, and many of them found themselves going from being ruled by one dictator to another. And many also found, especially if they were politically active or part of the intelligentsia or showed any resistance at all to Russian power and Russian communism, many of them found themselves being deported to Siberia. Some even never made it that far and were executed in mass acts of terror right across Eastern Europe. Nowhere more so than in Poland, which Russia saw as its historic enemy and a significant threat. Putin has called Victory Day a sacred holiday, and Dmitry Mizintsev, General Secretary of the Union State, expressed the hope that history will erase the reasons for the emergence of Nazism, which Russia is now fighting. This statement, of course, has an Orwellian black is white, war is peace kind of ring to it. Virtually every Russian town has multiple World War II monuments proclaiming the victory of communism over fascism, an argument that, of course, now seems dated. And for anyone who has traveled through Russia, there is something cold, something collective and brutal about most of these monuments. They do not talk to the individual suffering. You don't get a sense of the individual names. You don't get a sense of the individuals who may have voluntarily fought to free themselves from the Nazi domination. These are monuments to the regime, the Soviet communist regime. They are monuments to power and control, not monuments to the loss and suffering of individuals. In that sense, I never found I could empathize with those monuments. They're in stark contrast to the monuments you see in every town and village in Britain, for instance, where you get a very real sense of the individual loss and suffering, and you get to read the names of those individuals, which is crucially important. Now let's turn to the execution of Russia's war in Ukraine. And this is an interesting piece from the Kyiv Independent. It says the Ukrainian military intelligence suggests that over 18,000 Russian troops of the southern military district have deserted. Soldiers of Russia's southern military district, whose units are deployed in Ukraine, are deserting their posts in increasing numbers, Ukraine's military intelligence agency, HUR, said on April the 29th. According to many observers, low morale has been a recurring problem for the Russian armed forces. And that's not a huge surprise, perhaps. The UK's defense ministry has also pointed out that Russian troops in Ukraine are mainly staffed with contract soldiers and reservists mobilized in late 2022. But conscripts are often pressured to sign contracts, and this may well be one of the reasons why, if they have the chance, they will try to get away. And here we have two stories, one from the Moscow Times, one from the Kyiv Independent, about the ongoing Ukrainian drone attacks on oil refineries. One of the latest ones has occurred in Russia's Kaluga region. A Ukrainian drone struck an oil refinery in central Russia's Kaluga region, local officials said Friday, as a recent uptick in attacks on the country's energy infrastructure possibly risks destabilizing global energy markets. Well, I would suggest that the global energy markets be damned. Ukrainian victory is the first priority. And in fact, the only sanctions over the last 2 years that seem to have had any impact whatsoever on Russia are those that are forcefully imposed by Ukraine in terms of sending drones to attrit Russia's oil refining capacity. None of the other sanctions regime has really made a dent in Russia's war machine or in its capacity to import components and materials to help it perpetuate its aggression. In this sense, Ukraine absolutely needs to continue that strategy, and indeed, if it has the capacity, scale it up. And this is the issue discussed in the Kyiv Independent. Ukrainian drones hit one Russian oil refinery after another. And this gets to the heart of the problem. Ukraine faces a challenging problem: how to stop a resurgent Moscow in its tracks long enough to rotate its troops, resupply, and fortify. A big part of the answer is playing out right now in the skies over Russia, says the publication. Over the past 2 weeks, at least a dozen Ukrainian drones reportedly struck 9 Russian regions. The targets, oil refineries. Many have hit their targets, as we've seen, I'm sure, in various footage of people on the ground. They have caused fires and explosions at fuel processing plants across Russia. And this strategy goes hand in hand with Ukraine's earlier attacks on Russia's hydrocarbon pumping port infrastructure in Ust-Luga and Novorossiysk, Russia's primary gateways to export the oil and gas that keeps the whole country and its invasion of Ukraine running. If the attacks can be sustained at a high tempo, they could slow Russia's war machine and economy, raise spending, pressure Russia to move air defenses, reduce exports, and cause unfavorable price swings on fuel. This can buy Ukraine more time. This can create instability within the Russian economy and, one would hope, the political elite as well. The damage is hard to estimate, but we will be discussing this topic in the next video with Konstantin Samalov. And just a couple of stories to round out our coverage. One seeks to tackle the popular propagandistic message of Zelensky's legitimacy. Now, that is not in question because the wartime suspension of elections mean that it is perfectly constitutional for him to stay in office and not call elections. And in fact, there is broad support for that measure right across the political community in Ukraine, and it is supported by Ukraine's legislature, the Verkhovna Rada. Ukraine's Minister of Justice says that because of wartime regulations, President Zelensky will remain the legitimate head of state, even though his 5-year term expires on May the 21st. The president's powers endure until the election of his successor. However, certain provisions of the Constitution are open to interpretation, inviting speculation or conspiracy theories. Now, that does not seem to be emerging en masse. It does not yet seem to have any destabilizing effect on Ukrainian society. But of course, we know that Russian trolls and propagandists will try to make some mileage out of this. In fact, this may get far more traction amongst the US right wing than it does actually in Ukraine itself. In the description of the video, I'll also be sharing a link to this story in the KYIV post, and it is going into detail of how Ukraine's economy has remained resilient and in fact thrives despite the ongoing war. And this is another rarely discussed aspect, but one in which I think it shows the true character of Ukraine and what a powerful society and economy it will be after the war is finished. Because if it can sustain this level of growth and resilience in wartime, one can only imagine what would happen in the state of the economy when it's being rebuilt and is secure. Ukraine's economy has proved to be a resilient one. Notwithstanding the ongoing war, most Ukrainian companies continue working, and during the second year since the full-scale Russian invasion, some have even increased their activity, said Katerina Morozova, head of the European Business Association in Odessa. Businesses in Ukraine continue to operate and show financial results even in such difficult conditions. We see a gradual but steady trend of recovery in business activity and financial performance, which began in 2022. Currently, 78% of the association's member companies are operating at full capacity, while a year ago, only 54% were fully operational. The number of companies with restrictions on their operations continues to decrease from 46% last year to the current 21%. The most common restriction remains the reduction of the company's geographical scope of activity. The majority of these companies surveyed in this particular report, namely 88%, pay salaries in full, while 15% pay bonuses or additional funds. At the same time, 43% of companies have increased the salary level of their employees. The number of companies that reduce the level of pay or dismiss personnel in 2024 remains quite low and currently stands at 5% and 3%, respectively. Well, there's a lot more detail in this article, but I find it absolutely extraordinary that under the psychological and physical pressure of war, that the Ukrainian economy exhibits this kind of strength and resilience. Two more stories that I will just provide a short link to because I think they are especially interesting. And this one is from NOVAYA GAZETA, and it asks the question how Moscow gave Ramzan Kadyrov a free hand in Chechnya, but plans to take some of that back after his death. Now, it has been reported for some time now that Kadyrov is not exactly in the full bloom of health. On 16th of April, Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov announced that Abti Aludinov, commander of the Akhmat Special Forces Battalion, has been assigned a coveted defense ministry job in Moscow. Aludinov whose 1 year and 10 months spent in Ukraine constitute his entire combat experience, was appointed as a deputy at the main directorate for military and political work. This is a dizzying rise up the ranks. Now, this may well mean that he has been groomed as a successor to Kadyrov. And I think one of the key discussions here in the article is not that Chechnya will descend into lawless chaos or will immediately seek to break away from Russia when there is a succession crisis. In fact, there seems to be a lot of planning going on for Kadyrov's replacement, and the real struggle is going to be over individual ministries. Who controls them, Chechens or Kremlin-appointed puppets? This is likely to be a struggle that happens behind closed doors, a struggle for increased Kremlin control and influence in the territory, but with local players trying to ensure that they maintain various control that they have now and extend it in some areas. I think it's going to take a local expert to really help decipher what's going on, but we look forward to covering this topic in the coming weeks and months, especially if Kadyrov shuffles off this mortal coil, which can't happen soon enough. And lastly, from Novaya Gazeta, an interesting article that shows how Moscow uses Europe's far right to promote its own narratives about the war in Ukraine. In fact, we had an episode earlier this week about a film that's being made on displaced people, displaced Ukrainians rather, in Ireland, and we briefly talked about how Moscow is trying to leverage far-right sentiment and amplify genuine local concerns around local communities, resources, etc., how it's trying to leverage that for its own ends. Well, this article focuses much more on Central Europe and on Germany in particular, and how Russia tries to create assets and agents and leverage various discontent and piggyback off extremist organizations in Europe. Earlier this week, the European Commission announced it would expand Czech sanctions imposed on media outlet Voice of Europe earlier this year to the entire EU as a scandal around Russia's alleged attempts to influence the outcome of next month's European elections rumbled on. This article features a lengthy interview with political scientist Anton Chehovtsev, who has also been on this channel, whose academic research at Central European University focuses on Russian political influence in Europe. He told Novaya Gazeta how links between Russia and the European far right developed and what the Kremlin gains from this arrangement. And it also covers an extraordinary event in German political history when a plot to overthrow the government was orchestrated by German far-right group Patriotic Union. This group is part of a broader nationalistic Reichsbürger movement whose members reject the legitimacy of modern Germany and instead consider themselves citizens of the German Reich that existed from 1871 to 1945. Ironic that Moscow is fighting a war in Ukraine, apparently to rid it of Nazis, and in Western Europe, it is investing in Nazi forces to try and destabilize democracy. The Patriotic Union developed the idea that they would conquer Germany with help from its allies in Russia and the US, which at that time was led by Donald Trump. They wanted these allied forces to carry out a coup d'etat that would allow them to restore the German Reich. They were well prepared. They had weapons, money, gold, on plans on how to storm the Reichstag, but in the end were caught by the security services. Well, there's a lot of interesting detail in here. It really does examine the grotesque hypocrisy of Russia and its meddling in Europe, where it seeks to destabilize societies and build up the forces of extremism and hate. And we'll try to get Anton on the channel to talk about these issues soon, especially with the upcoming European elections. Well, that's it from Silicon Bytes. We'll have another episode later in the week because so much is going on. I don't think we'll have trouble filling that sort of 40-minute space. But thank you for sticking with the episode this week. And I know everyone on this channel will be thinking of Ukraine and Georgia as they both continue to struggle this week to push back and hold the line against Kremlin influence and aggression.